Hello and welcome to the Soviet Re-enactors chat, the SRC. I'm Francis Pullum and I'm chairman of the Krasny Konserv reenactment group.
And I am Jordan. I am a member of the 13th Guards Living History Society based in the north east of England.
So this is a new podcast that we've decided to set up during the lockdown, something for us to do, something that we can discuss between each other and with you guys, our interests in history, specifically Soviet history, from a point of view of both a reenactor and a history enthusiast.
Yeah, so anything that we talk about during these chats is strictly non-political. We might get into some quite grim topics, and some may be viewed as controversial, but we are looking at purely from a historical and an educational standpoint, where we are here to tell the story of people who have sacrificed their lives and their livelihoods and their entire families in quite possibly one of the bloodiest conflicts known to man.
Absolutely, and I think that we've chosen some interesting subjects for our very first episode. For disclosure for the audience, we sat down and between us chose 5 topics to talk about each. We then narrowed that down to 3 topics each, and we let the other person choose what our first topic was going to be. And I'd like to thank you very much for such a interesting topic to start off with, and a very not very deep question, not a very political question. But so this video will be split into 2. The first half we'll be discussing the Soviet POW, and in the second half,
in the second half I'll be talking about the use of Soviet incendiary bottles, or as they're commonly known as Molotov cocktails, and the history and use of them.
Wonderful.
I think we'll have an interesting chat.
Yeah, I think we're going to have a very interesting discussion. I think we're going to learn a lot. Obviously, as we said, the topics we're going to be covering may include subjects which are distressing. Depending on how we edit this, we might include some photographs that some people might find distressing. So please be aware that we're looking at real events here. We're looking at technology which is designed to kill, and we're looking at an event which killed millions.
Yes.
So it's very important that we stress that.
Yeah. If anyone does feel that they aren't able to view some of these images, I think we should give them a little bit of a warning beforehand, so they can still listen to it. For instance, if they're driving their car and they're going somewhere, I think they can still listen to it, but not solely look at these videos. So we will give sort of a warning beforehand.
Yeah. We're also not infallible. We might make mistakes. We might say some things which people don't necessarily agree with, and that's absolutely fine. We encourage a discussion, and we look forward to reading some of your comments down in the description down below.
I mean, I'm no expert on any of this. I probably will make mistakes. I know that for a fact. If I don't make mistakes, then it's not me. That's the way I look at it. So if there is something that I've or Frank has gotten wrong, please let us know in the comments. And it's all about education. I mean, we are still learning. I still learn new things every single day, and that's the whole point of these chats, is to help promote knowledge and history.
Absolutely, absolutely.
A little bit of background from me is I am originally, still am, from Scotland, but I do travel quite a lot to go to reenacting events. About 3 years ago now, I actually went on travelling in Eastern Europe. I went everywhere from Berlin, Prague, Warsaw, and even ended up in Russia, in Moscow, in St. Petersburg. And when I was there, I quite liked history. I liked history before that. And then I was there, I got to see quite a lot of museums. Like before that, like I could tell you what a T-34 tank was, but like I couldn't actually tell you really anything about the Eastern Front. especially from the Soviet perspective. I couldn't tell, like, I knew what the Battle of Stalingrad was, I had saw enemy at the gates, you know, that was the extent of my knowledge. But by the time I got back home, I did kind of think to myself, you know what, I would like to learn more. And one night, probably about 1 o'clock in the morning, where I couldn't really sleep, I decided to, you know, go on a bored Google search. And that's when I found the 38th Guards Living History group. And since then, I joined. I got in contact with the unit's commander, John, and I've been attending events ever since. I've been learning along the way, building up on specific areas where I find quite a lot of interest in. So yeah, that's pretty much my story. What about yours, Frank?
I've always sort of been into military history. When I was a kid, it was predominantly aeroplanes. I was brought up on Spitfires and Hurricanes and Messerschmitts and B-17s, any sort of aeroplane, and that was my thing. But then when I was about 12 years old, we went to the Bovington Tank Museum, and my eyes were open to the world of the ground forces within military history. For whatever reason, I still don't know to this day, perhaps it's insanity, I was drawn predominantly to the Soviet tanks. I came away from that trip with a model KV-1 and a model King Tiger, and my life changed from there on. My passion in Soviet tanks grew and grew and grew until I was about the age of 20. And I really started to focus in on the T-35 tank as something that I was particularly fascinated in. I also built model kits, as I said, so for me, I would build model kits off the photographs of the vehicles from the war. But with the T-35, I noticed that there was a bit of a gap in the market where, you know, we knew the chassis numbers and we had the combat records of the 67th and 68th Tank Regiments that these vehicles fought in. And it wasn't really too hard to put 2 and 2 together with the help of Google Earth and, you know, these original German photographs. And all the way back in 2017, I released my first book. You should all go and buy it. Through that, I got into crewing tanks. I've got a couple of friends who own T-34s. I admit I'm very lucky in that sense. I went to shows as a civvy, dressed in civvies, but I introduced people to the tanks and I taught them through the history. Yeah. And after a while, it sort of became, yeah, I could do this, but I could do it in a uniform. So me and my mate Will, we looked around at our local reenactment groups, and they were all very good, but they didn't do the things we wanted. We wanted to focus on the tanks, and we wanted to focus on Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion of the Soviet Union, which not many groups tend to do. Therefore, we decided to start our own, which is the Krasny Commissar Reenactment Group. And that's where I am today.
Excellent. That is an excellent book, by the way. Like, when I first met Frank and we first started chatting, I actually didn't know that like he was an author at all. Only found that out like a couple of days ago. And then I got the Kindle version of his book, and I'm actually quite enjoying it myself, because I quite like the multi-targeted early war Soviet tanks like the T-35 and T-28. So yeah, that's good. It's quite scratches my little itch of Soviet tank history.
I appreciate that. That's sweet. Yeah. You're always your own worst critic, and you know I look at the book and I think, there's so much I want to change and what have you. But no, I appreciate the positive feedback.
Yeah. Everyone's hindsight is 20/20, as they say.
Oh God, yeah. So the very first topic we have for you today is an absolute doozy. It's not an easy topic. I found it quite interesting but difficult to research, both on an emotional level and on the amount of information that there is. So I'll try to keep it as brief and as concise as I can during this discussion. But the very first question is, or the very first topic, should I say, is the Soviet prison of war, life in German captivity. So obviously with warfare, some combatants will not get killed and will not retreat. Some combatants will be captured by the enemy. They will be processed by the enemy and generally put into POW camps, and if the combatants are adhering to the Geneva Convention, they will be well treated, well fed, looked after, given medical treatment, given human rights. However, unfortunately, this is not the case for the Soviet POW, and their plight is quite a distressing one. So for the very first topic, we're choosing a very touchy subject. So if this is something that you're a little bit more sensitive on, I would recommend skipping along to the next subject.
Like I said, when I was traveling Eastern Europe, when I was in Krakow, probably pronouncing that wrong again, I actually visited Auschwitz, the famous concentration camp, and I didn't exactly know too much about Soviet POWs. It wasn't something that I knew a tremendous amount about. But when I saw that they were one of the leading percentages of casualties through concentration camps, it really, it helps drive a nail into that, like, almost no one was safe in Eastern Europe from concentration camps.
Yeah, well, it's an interesting fact that the second highest percentage of casualties in the Holocaust was Soviet POWs. Famously, Jews made up 6 million deaths in the Holocaust, and that was followed by 3.3 million Soviet POWs who were killed under Nazi control.
I mean, I personally wonder where did it all start, and I know that can be construed as going all the way back to, the early days of the rise of the Nazi Party in Germany. But when you take into consideration the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and the fact that in the early stages of World War II, Soviet Russia and Nazi Germany both signed non-aggression pacts, and they viewed each other as friends, and there was a lot of coordination and working together at that moment. So I wonder how they sort of got to that stage where, the border guards that shared cigarettes on the night shift would turn into die-hard enemies.
Sure. I mean, it's no secret that Hitler held anti-Bolshevik and anti-Jewish sentiments from a very early stage in his political career. In Mein Kampf, when he talks about Lebensraum towards the east, he talks about having to exterminate the Slavic peoples. He viewed them very much as Untermensches. This had to be put on the back foot for political reasons when, as you said, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was signed. That non-aggression pact, it was good for both sides in the sense of it allowed Germany to invade Poland and focus on the West, and it gave the Soviet Union space to fight a war with Finland, invade the Baltic states, and occupy Bukovina in Romania. However, the anti-Slavic sentiments would start to bubble up again very quickly after the fall of France, and when Hitler's eyes are starting to move from west back to east. And interestingly enough, in the months leading up to Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion, there are several military decrees which are actually given on how soldiers should be viewing Slavic soldiers and soldiers from the Soviet Union and civilians. On May 13th, 1941, for example, the decree of the Judition and martial law on special measures of the troops was ordered. This is actually sometimes called the Barbarossa Decree. It was a series of orders that told the soldier that the war in the East was a war of extermination, and it gave orders such as every German officer is expected to shoot people for the greater cause. Prisoners of war were not to be treated humanely, and the idea of a Judeo-Bolshevik structure in the Soviet Union was floated. From the very start, as I said, the Germans viewed the Soviets as Untermensch as disposable people, less than animals. And while, as I said, this was put on the back burner for the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, it began to bubble up. Again, on May 19th, 1941, mind you, this is only 23 days before the invasion, the guidelines for the conduct of the troops in Russia was issued. Again, this was aimed at the fighting man on the ground rather than the officers. And again, it said that the Slavic people were subhuman. It stated that women and children in particular were to be treated with extreme harshness. It said that it gave orders such as consensual sexual intercourse between a German man and Soviet women was race defilement. So it's all giving this information that these people are subhuman. You don't treat them nicely. They are the ultimate enemy of the Aryan people. Yeah. And I think that this is all finalized in the commissar order, which I think a lot of people are very familiar with. The commissar order was issued on June 18th, 1941, and it was strict orders given to the German officer corps on what to do with a particular type of POW. Obviously, in the Red Army, you had a Politruk rank, which was essentially a political advisor to a Red Army unit. His job was to make sure that each unit was loyal, essentially, to the Communist Party and were conducting themselves in a communist manner. The Wehrmacht, the Nazis, the German High Command saw them as an incredibly dangerous threat because once captured, they could cause the POWs to rise up against their German captors. I have written down here the exact order, and I think that it's actually quite distressing, especially when you think that this was actually implemented. Yeah. The order states that troops are to be made aware that in this battle, no mercy or considerations of international law is accepted. The commissars are a danger to our own safety, and the rapid pacification of the conquered territories is utmost. The originators of barbaric Asiatic methods of warfare are the political commissars. So immediate and unhesitatingly severe measures must be undertaken against them. They are therefore, when captured in battle, as a matter of routine, to be dispatched with firearms. Political commissars, as agents of the enemy troops, are recognizable from their special badges, a red star with a golden hammer and sickle on their sleeves. They are to be separated from prisoners of war immediately and on the battlefield. This is necessary to remove them from any possibility of influencing the captured soldiers. These commissars are not to be recognized as soldiers. The protection due to prisoners of war under international law does not apply to them. So this is a German government order to its troops that they should not be following international laws on the treatment of POWs, and this particular type of POW you should kill straight away. Yeah, I think that that is already that's reflecting what's to come in the bigger battle.
Yeah, I mean that reminds me of the infamous commando order that was issued later in the war, where any commandos that were found behind enemy lines or during raiding patrols were to be shot or sent to concentration camps and not to be regarded as prisoners of war.
Absolutely.
Treated as spies as such.
Absolutely. The commissar order and all the orders that we've just very briefly discussed, I think there's the culmination, the defining line in these orders comes in the commissar order, which essentially says that German soldiers that would commit a crime under German law against these people haven't committed a crime, i.e. that gives the German army, the German soldier, carte blanche to do what they want to POWs, essentially.
Yeah. Yeah, that's I can see where this is going, and I'm sure if anyone has even the most basic understanding of the war on the Eastern Front, then they can see, you know, all the horrible things that happened, especially against the civilian populations. I mean, was treating Red Army. They were treating Red Army in the early days of the war. They would burn villages to the ground so that they wouldn't get into the hands of the Wehrmacht and German armies, and you'd have hordes of refugees trying to outrun the German army, and it's fairly evident why.
I think that looking at these sorts of orders really shows the difference between the type of warfare we see on the Western Front to the Eastern Front. Am I saying that the sacrifice of French and British and American soldiers isn't just as valiant? No. But the type of warfare that was fought on the Eastern Front was far more of a total war. It was a war of annihilation set out from the very start.
Exactly. I think that is the defining comment on it, and what the war really was. It was a war of annihilation. It was going to be them, it was going to be us, and the Germans and the Russians, they certainly weren't wanting to be the losing party. It really is absolutely barbaric, in some of the instances that we're going to probably hear about. You're going to tell us.
Sure, absolutely. So what we've just sort of looked at briefly is what the Germans are looking at implementing when they invade the Soviet Union. We can already see that it's not a nice doctrine at all. I mean, okay, war's not nice in general, but what we're looking at here is an almost systematic extermination and an idea that these people were subhuman and Untermensch, and you know, they're not going to be treated great, are they?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, when I visited Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration camp, it really did hammer home a lot of points that, like, you may see in the TV, you may see on the internet, but actually being there, it really does hammer home some things. I mean, the one thing that really sort of struck me is when you walk into one of the rooms that they take on one of the guided tours, they actually show you the confiscated items and giant behind the glass in giant rooms, and they're just piles of certain types of confiscated items, and you know, you get things like hairbrushes. But the one thing that really gripped at me was seeing the shoes, and it may seem quite, why would shoes like hammer home a point to you? But it's when you looked at all the different types that were there, you would see army boots, you would see women's shoes with heels, you would see essentially tattered old shoes from a farmer, but you would also see things like the tiny shoes of a child, a baby, and when you think of like the pure barbarity behind that, it really is. It kind of made my stomach kind of turn, and I like to think that I've got quite an iron stomach, and I can witness quite a lot of things, but that was quite something.
I mean, it's funny, even Himmler, when he visited some of these concentration camps, he couldn't stomach what he saw, and he's the man that ordered all this to happen.
Yeah.
So yeah, the barbarity that we're about to see in our story is truly evil.
Yeah, it really is horrific. So if anyone listening feels that it may be a bit discomforting, I'm sure we'll put a timestamp in the description to points where we're not actually talking about things that are
100%.
Yeah.
So let's look at what actually happens then when a Soviet soldier is captured. So obviously the German invasion begins at 4:30 in the morning on June 22nd, 1941. The Soviets are somewhat caught unawares. They've been told for a few weeks now to prepare for action, but the mechanized units and the infantry units, they haven't had enough time to recover from the purges and the reorganization that the Red Army is currently going through. and therefore, unfortunately, a lot of soldiers are captured quickly in the first few weeks, all the way up really until we start getting into the winter months. You get massive encirclements of soldiers. A lot do fight. I think there's a bit of a myth that the Soviet soldier in 1941 was a pushover. This isn't the case. A lot of men fought hard and died defending their soil. An interesting fact is that German casualties in July 1941, so the second week onwards of their invasion, were higher than at any other point in the war until the Battle of Stalingrad. That's how ferocious some of the fighting was in those early days. As I said, though, a lot of soldiers were captured, and their treatment at this point was very dependent on who they were captured by and in what means they were captured. Regular Wehrmacht units were more kind to POWs than SS units. Their treatment wasn't good by any stretch of imagination, but it wasn't as severe as if the SS caught you. Orders like the commissar order were fulfilled. If a group of Soviet soldiers was captured, the first thing they would do is determine rank. They would find, if they found a political politruk, they would take him aside and they would shoot him. They would find the commanding troops and organize them separately. The first thing they would do is take off any ammunition, any weapons, anything dangerous on the soldier's person. Discard that. They would also take off collar ranks, any other sort of indication of leadership. Then they would confiscate every piece of kit of the soldier, except, generally speaking, a mess tin, a water canteen, and they let them keep a bag to keep food in. And funny enough, that's normally the gas mask bag they chose. I don't know why. I'm assuming because it was easy take on and off over the shoulder.
Possibly.
So for the most part, the act of being captured wasn't super bad, in the sense of, people were shot just because of their political rank, but far worse is to come. If you're captured by the SS, you would not see any kind of positive treatment. When you look at German photographs, you can actually find Soviet POWs enjoying a cigarette and a food break with German soldiers. There's that almost camaraderie link of, we're both combat men, we both fought, let's just calm down before we move on to the next section. SS would not have done that. It would have been far more ruthless, far more willing to kill anyone at the first sign of weakness and the first sign of any sort of defiance.
And I think that's where we start to see the sort of differences between the regular Wehrmacht and the political soldiers of the SS, and the just pure division and political essence behind it all.
I think
even on the Western front, the SS in the early days committed some grievous acts. I mean, if you look at forgive me, mine's drawn a blank, but I believe it was the 51st Highland Division, I may be wrong, they suffered quite there was a massacre in the early days in the withdrawal from France that was committed by the 3rd SS Token SS Division. Again, I'm not an expert on that, I may be wrong about certain details. However, if anyone knows more, please let us know.
As a side note, my great uncle very narrowly missed that massacre himself. He was in Royal Army Medical Corps, and he was in B Company, and A Company were captured and was involved in that shooting. But regardless, so the initial capture isn't great, but as I said, far worse is to come. So the German idea of Operation Barbarossa was a very swift victory. They had this idea in their head that it would be a matter of 3 or 4 months and they'd be in Moscow partying. They didn't believe that the Red Army would be able to put up a fight, and they believed, famously, as I believe it was Guderian said, all you have to do is kick down the door and the whole rotten shack will collapse. As we know, this wasn't actually the case, but that didn't help Soviet POWs because the German infrastructure for the processing of POWs wasn't there. Very little consideration was given to what was going to happen to a POW once he was captured. POWs would be rounded into collecting areas which were essentially transit camps, and they could be left there for weeks with no shelter, no food other than what they had on them, and no water other than what they had on them. Any wounded man who was captured initially was actually taken away and disposed of, i.e. shot. The German infrastructure wasn't prepared to look after the lame and sick. So after arriving at these transit camps, you'd only have fit fighting men. From there, the Germans did begin setting up POW camps for these men. There were 2 different ways you could end up at your camp. If you were one of the lucky ones, you were taken by train to some prisoner of war camp in Poland or Germany. But the conditions on these trains were not good. The German High Command only offered open-top rail cars for POW transport, and they would cram in as many men as they possibly could into these rail cars, send them on their way, and then often would just leave them in sidings for a week, just because they didn't care for their lives, and there was so much rail traffic and processing to be done on the advance that they just didn't give any humanity to these POWs, and many actually died in transit on these rail cars going to POW camps in Poland and Germany. And as I said, these are the lucky ones. If you were unlucky, you would be marched to a POW camp in former Soviet territory. These marches can be compared to the death marches of Asia. They were often hundreds of kilometers with no food or water. And German records from both the train rides and these marches indicate that, depending on the distances involved and how well they were treated, between 25 and 75% of the POWs who went on these marches died. We're already looking at tens of thousands who were dying just on their way to POW camps. Now, once they physically got to these areas which were going to be the POW camps, they found nothing there, these POWs. There was a fenced-off area, and it had no shelter, nothing. It was essentially an open field. These were called Russenlager by the Germans, which quite literally means Russian camps. And once they arrived, they had 2 options, really. Either dig a hole in the ground to sleep in, or very occasionally they were allowed to erect pavilions, which are structures which just have roofs, so stilts and a roof for shelter. That is all these guys were given once they got to POW camps.
Probably the best correlation you could probably give to that is, you wouldn't even treat a dog like as bad as that. I mean, you give a dog house if it's sleeping outside. You give it a nice blanket. You treat it well. I mean,
these POWs. Yeah, absolutely. And these POWs were seen by their captors as literal subhuman, not worth their time. These camps were guarded by the Gestapo, they were guarded by the SS and other special policing units. Because there was no infrastructure pre-planned for this, and because of Nazi ideology on them being subhumans, the official Nazi doctrine on the treatment of these POWs was starvation, i.e. extermination by starving to death. The POWs in this period, and we're only currently talking June 1941, the German invasion, until January 1942, it gets a lot worse. They've only got a ration of 700 calories a day to eat, and most of what they're eating is bread which is made from sawdust. So they're not getting any sort of substantial calorific intake because of this policy of starvation.
Yeah. And again, it's for those that may not know particular first-hand accounts. I mean, if you look at the treatment of British and American POWs in Asia, I mean, that's kind of the same where you'd find when once liberated, if they did survive, they were essentially walking skeletons.
Absolutely.
It would be a horrific sight to see.
And this is how the Soviet POW found himself, unfortunately, as I said, for this duration of about 6 months. There was over 20 POW camps specifically for Soviet prisoners across former Soviet Union, Poland, and in Germany. And unfortunately, due to these conditions, the death rate was extraordinary. Disease was very common, and I actually have some statistics here, or some figures on particular camps and some of the nastiness that happened there. So, for example, at Stalag 359, 6,000 Soviet POWs were shot for contracting dysentery. This execution happened between the 21st and the 28th of September. And on the first day alone, 3,261 POWs were shot for being ill. At Stalag 2B, there was a typhoid epidemic. An unknown number died, but at just this camp, there were 38,383 POWs. And one more, at Stalag 3A, there was a typhus outbreak which killed 2,000 men at the end of 1941. These camps are, we will show some pictures that we have, if we can, of them, but they are essentially open fields with holes in the ground that men huddle in to die. That's the most diplomatic way of putting it. And it gets even worse when we get to the winter. Famously, the German army was not prepared for a prolonged winter, despite it being Russia. And the same can be said for the rear troops, both logistic and POWs, and everyone was unprepared. And unfortunately, a lot of Soviet POWs actually had their clothes stolen by their guards to keep them warm, which obviously then caused thousands more deaths due to exposure and hypothermia. Yeah. I'm trying my best, to tell the facts and figures, but it's a really distressing situation that you find. And as you said, you sort of compare that treatment to Allied POWs, and it's a completely different world, completely different.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we look at pretty much nearly every Christmas when we see The Great Escape on TV, and we see, again, it's not, a complete historical account day by day, but it does paint a picture of what life is like for a Western prisoner of war, and yes, they'd experienced quite some hardships, but they also enjoyed quite a lot of freedom and comforts compared to Soviet prisoners of war.
Absolutely.
And personally, I don't think I could ever imagine being able to do that to people. I mean, you may be cold, but imagine if you're a guard there, you may be stood there absolutely freezing, but at least you've just had a warm breakfast and lunch, and you can go back and have a warm cup of soup. Whereas you see men that are quickly becoming skeletons dying in front of you. Oh, but he's got quite a nice greatcoat, I think I'll have that.
Absolutely. And during this prolonged torture, which is essentially what it is. The POWs were still expected to, be available for roll call and obey German orders, and at the same time all this is going on, you've got the Gestapo going through and weeding out. There was a weeding out program, undesirables and what have you. And they were also forced to build things. So in this emaciated state, the POWs were expected in some camps, not all camps, to construct better living quarters. For example, at Stalag 11C, 20,000 POWs arrived in July 1941, and then were ordered to construct shelter for themselves. The shelter was completed by the end of 1941, but just that act alone killed 14,000 of the prisoners. Stalag 11C is better known now as the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. So the camp that the British liberated was built by the hands and the blood of Soviet POWs.
Yeah, I mean, I would struggle, and I'm struggling to just picture that amount of people. Like, just even picture that amount of people are not in a normal context in your head. That is a vast amount of people. Like, that's populations of some towns across the UK completely gone.
Absolutely.
And to think in the method that they perished, it really is. It really does put things into a lot of a perspective. And it paints quite a bloody and gruesome picture.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So the thing that I'm like, how would you even maintain discipline in such squalor? I mean, yes, I can imagine these prisoners of war having next to no energy or ability, but you probably find that new prisoners coming in would still be trying to resist and trying to escape. So do you have any idea on how that would go?
So Soviet POWs were ruled over with essentially an iron fist. Mass shootings was the order of the day. If there was any sign of insolence, insubordination, disobedience towards the guards, they were merciless in just taking a bunch of them out and shooting them. As I hinted at previously, the Gestapo conducted weeding out operations through 1941 and 1942, where they would target intellectuals, Communist Party members, political politrons that had managed to slip through the system, and also Jews. So 5% of all Soviet POWs that were captured were Jews. Once a POW was established to be Jewish, he had to wear a Star of David, and if you can believe it, was treated worse than the other prisoners. Any sign of insubordination, it was just, right, you're shot, you're gone. These poor men lived on a lifeline. They obeyed or they died.
Yeah, and to be honest, I wouldn't feel bad for anyone who wanted to die in those conditions. I can picture just people being insolent just with the hope that it would just end the problem.
Just end the suffering, yeah.
How would you actually, how did these prison and war camps stay separate from quite a lot of the wider extermination camps? Or did they, like you mentioned before with the Bergen-Belsen example, did they evolve into becoming early concentration camps? Well, not early, for example, but actually evolving into larger concentration camps where it wouldn't just be Soviet prisoners of war. Did they exist throughout the rest of the war?
So interestingly, German doctrine changed in January 1942. The Nazi government realized that the war is going to be longer than expected, and they're going to need more German troops to fight. A lot of German men are currently tied up in German industry. So the treatment towards Soviet POWs changed from extermination by starvation to slave labor. That's not across the board. It was done on a sort of almost camp by camp basis. As I said, the population of these prisoners were dwindling and dwindling and dwindling. Yeah, they were being freshly topped up by new POWs, but the death rate was so high and disease was so high that they were losing, thousands of people a month.
They couldn't meet the turnover of
Absolutely.
what they were expecting today.
So it was decided that some of these camps would be converted into more general concentration camps. Some would be work camps, and others were actually just closed altogether. After spring of 1942, POW camps that had been established specifically for Soviet POWs had actually either been totally cleared or converted into labour or concentration camps. So it was a very quick turnover from scattered concentration Soviet POW camps to converted work camps or labour camps. Interestingly enough, before the war broke out, before any of this happened, there was a German organisation which was literally just called Organisation TODS, which was a government and civilian working program, and nearly all POWs that ended up as workers ended up working for this company. And from the introduction of POW workers in the company in 1942 until 1944, 1.4 million POWs would be 1.4 million workers would be forced to work for this company. 1% were Germans who were ejected from military service. 1.5% were concentration camp prisoners, i.e. non-combatants, Jews, gypsies. And the remaining 97.5% were Soviet POWs. Not only that, many POWs ended up working in the Ruhr region, which is obviously where the German heavy industry is. And a lot ended up as miners. Obviously, mining is a very dangerous job. And German statistics on the survival rate of these POWs show that, for example, just between July 1st and November 10th, 1943, 27,638 Soviet POWs died in the Ruhr mines. So these guys, they're disposable, absolutely disposable to the German government. So yeah, if you were lucky, I suppose, you'd end up in one of these work camps and working for the German government or in heavy industry or in munitions. Your life is still terrible. Your calorie intake is, near 1,000 instead of the recommended 2,000. But it is more of an escape than the unlucky ones that end up in concentration camps. I couldn't find, unfortunately, too much information on how prisoners were selected to be concentration camp inmates or labour camp inmates. In many respects, it does sort of appear that it was due to if you were Jewish or not and undesirable, and if you were unlucky enough to just be in that area in the first place. So, for example, Auschwitz-Birkenau was a POW camp, had a POW camp with it, along with the concentration camp. And unfortunately, these POWs were actually some of the first people to be gassed in Zyklon B experiments. So on the 3rd of September 1941, so a good 6 months before the final solution was written into law, 600 Soviet POWs were gassed in a gas chamber with Zyklon B as an experiment to see if it was effective on humans. when we look at Auschwitz in general, 18,000 POWs were sent to Auschwitz in one go. They were brought there in 1942. 3,000 were exterminated on the spot, sent straight to gas chambers, which left us 15,000 POWs. By the last roll call in the last days of the camp running in 1945, there were only 92 survivors. So over that period, essentially 18,000 people died in that camp, either worked to death or sent to the gas chambers.
I mean, you can, I'd like to say you can imagine, but you really can't.
No.
I mean, Stalin said it, the death of one person is a tragedy, but the death of millions is just a statistic.
And it's interesting that Stalin's son was actually at one of these concentration camps rather than a POW camp. He was actually at Sachsenhausen concentration camp. This was actually the camp which executed the largest number of Soviet POWs. For example, 9,090 were executed between August 31st and October 2nd, 1941, just sent in and shot. Famously, Stalin's son, and I'm going to butcher his name, Lieutenant Yakov Zubshavili, he was there. He was discovered that he was in fact Stalin's son, and he was used by the Germans as a bartering tool. Famously, Stalin didn't bend to this, and unfortunately he committed suicide or he was shot by guards. We're not sure either way, but he died in Sachsenhausen.
Yeah, I believe they tried to swap him twice. From what I've read, and it's only briefly, but I believe that I think it was Hitler's nephew was captured by the Red Army, and he wanted to try and get a trade done. Again, Stalin said no, and then I believe it was it General Paulus?
I'm not entirely sure. I'm sure that I've read somewhere that it was German officers that they were trying to barter. Unfortunately, I didn't write down the exact trade.
Yeah, but I think it was Stalin said, "I will not trade a general for just a lieutenant," and it just shows that, first of all, that Stalin really didn't care about his own son, and just gives him that sense of barbarity as well, which I think we'll probably cover potentially in later episodes if we choose to do so. But also the just horrible treatment, and you can see that if you get into that situation and you are the son of the leader of the opposing country, of course, they're going to try and use your barter, but I think he probably also knew that he was going to use for propaganda pieces, and I don't think anybody would want that. So I wouldn't blame him if he did commit suicide, especially in the conditions that he'd be living in. I know that quite a lot of collaborators, especially in the Eastern Front, with the Eastern legions, collaborated with the Germans. Actually, with the British Free Corps there, but that was in the West. But the Russian Liberation Army, Verona, how were they recruited? Did they go around the prisoner of war camps, or?
Yes. So as I said, Soviet POWs were forced to work for the German industry, but POWs who expressed willingness to collaborate with the Germans were allowed to do so. Unofficially, the first Russian units were established in 1942, but Hitler refused to allow them to actually be autonomous with Russian leaders. He didn't trust them, and they weren't allowed to fight. However, Russian collaboratist units were actually involved in the Stalingrad campaign. Many of these people were anti-communist, but a large number only joined because they saw better treatment in German servitude than dying in concentration camps or in labor camps. As you said, there was an organization called the Russian Liberation Army, but this wasn't actually established until 1944. During the Stalingrad campaign, a Soviet General Andrei A. Vlashov, was captured, and he defected to the German side, and he was instrumental in petitioning Hitler to allow ex-Soviet POWs to volunteer and serve in the Russian Liberation Army, which was abbreviated in German to the ROA. Interestingly, before the formation of the ROA, Ostenheiten, Eastern units, were integrated into Wehrmacht units, but they were deemed too unreliable to fight on the Eastern Front, so they were actually sent to the Western Front. Hence why we can actually find Russians fighting in Italy, and notably in Normandy. There were Ostheiten in the Normandy area during D-Day, and they had a very mixed success rate. Some of them put up very stiff resistance to the Allies, and others just surrendered at the first chance they got. Unfortunately for the Allies, they knew that they were fighting against units who were non-German, and they thought it was a good idea to advertise to these guys that, yeah, surrender to us, we'll repatriate you back to Russia. But most of these guys knew that was going to be a death sentence. So they promised them, we'll return you back to Russia, but they knew that would be a death sentence. However, the ROA was established in 1944. They saw sporadic action in the East, but the most notable action was actually during the Prague uprising in Czechoslovakia. They defected against their German overlords and fought with the Czech partisans. Because they were equipped like any other German unit, they actually had heavy weapons, and they were instrumental at stopping the SS from recapturing Prague from the Germans. So they're a real mixed bag. I think the fact that they deserted so quickly and flipped, especially in the East, on a coin, I think most of these men just wanted to get out of the harsh treatment, which was labour camps and work camps and concentration camps.
To be honest, I don't think anyone can really blame them, to be honest. I mean, if you're put in that sort of situation where you can go like, oh, do you want to go back to the camp, or do you want to fight for Germany and to rid the Soviet Russia of Bolshevism? We'll pay you, we'll give you food, you'll be safe-ish. It's kind of, it's black and white, really, isn't it? I mean, I wouldn't personally blame anyone that went through that, and I think it was what was quite, I don't want to say wrong, but also sad, with the Prague uprising, especially when it came to the Russian Liberation Army defecting. I know there's quite a lot of Cossacks, and they ended up in British custody.
Yeah.
And the British repatriated them to the USSR, where they were met by the lovely NKVD, and most of them were sent to gulags or shot. So,
absolutely.
I don't blame them.
And the way that the Soviets treated their POWs returning back to the Soviet Union was not good. And this is actually, the final thing we'll talk about before we move on to the other subject. So Soviet POWs had been coming into German occupation, obviously from June 22nd until the end of the war. 5.7 million POWs would be taken by the Germans, and 3.3 million would be killed under the German occupation. I would like to quickly point out that sources do disagree on how many were captured and how many killed. German sources are arguably the most reliable, and that's where those figures are from. Soviet sources suggest as little as 1.7 million POWs were captured. Personally, I'm more inclined to believe the German ones, only because they were the guys that were actually processing it, and they were very good at their paperwork with the Germans. However,
very meticulous keepers when it came to that sort of stuff.
Absolutely. However, as I said, we all know in post that the Germans lost the war. The Germans were on the retreat on the Eastern Front from the beginning of 1943 and sporadically retreated all the way through to 45. From mid-1944, really, the Soviets began finding the concentration camps, work camps, labour camps, death camps, and along with the countless civilians who were murdered and forced to work in these conditions, they found Soviet POWs. Unfortunately for many of them, Stalin had issued an order in August 1941, which was order number 270. This was the no surrender order, and it was given to the Red Army by order of Stalin that no Red Army man will surrender, you shall fight to the last. This unfortunately tainted most POWs with a brush of you surrendered willingly, and things, you were then a collaborator. The NKVD set up filtration camps in the liberated sectors to process POWs and civilians, and unfortunately we only have the NKVD numbers for those processed. However, so official Soviet figures show that by the end of 1946, 80% of those who were processed were civilians, and 20% of those that were processed were actually POWs. So as you can see by those figures, a lot more people that survived the Holocaust were civilians rather than Soviet POWs. And the figures break down even more clearly, and again, these are NKVD numbers, so take everything with a pinch of salt. However, 5% are civilians, and 43% of POWs were drafted back into the Red Army. 10% of civilians and 22% of POWs were sent to labour camps, and 2% of civilians and 15% of POWs were handed over to the NKVD, i.e. to the Gulag system. Yeah. Even those POWs which were cleared of any wrongdoing by the NKVD and released back into Soviet society found it incredibly difficult to re-assimilate. Most were tarred with a brush of they spent time in the West, therefore they're not trustworthy. They met Germans, they met Americans, they met British. They're not Soviet anymore. They found it hard to get jobs. They found it hard to just re-assimilate. Unfortunately, the Soviet system viewed them as traitors. Obviously, as you said, most that ended up in the hands of the NKVD were people like the Cossacks and collaborators who ended up, serving in the Russian Liberation Army. Most of them were sent to the gulags, and most probably died in that system. So, in conclusion of this little discussion, the Soviet POW was one of the most unfortunate people in the Second World War. They were treated from start to finish with no ounce of humanity, treated as animals. They were murdered in their millions, and even in liberation, they was treated poorly because they were captured.
Yeah, I mean, you hear all these stories, whether propaganda or from memoirs or just from history books, of fights to the death by Soviet troops. And when they do, I mean, if it, for those individuals, from what they heard, they would have been from, you know, they would be from propaganda, but that would, the propaganda in this instance would be quite true. And I think anyone would rather fight to the death rather than even risk facing that. And you can see why a lot of Soviet soldiers faced this issue, and why they put up such a ferocious response, especially when it comes to places like Leningrad, Stalingrad, Moscow, Odessa, Sevastopol. You know, it is something.
I think that's also partly why I chose a 1941 soldier for my reenactment, was in many ways to respect the POWs who didn't make it and were mistreated, because I think a lot of people tend to think of the Red Army in their highlights, the Battle of Stalingrad and Moscow and Bagration and eventually Berlin, and like, you know, they're the army of, they're a victorious army, but you know, 5.7 million of them were captured, let alone how many were killed. And the ones that were captured were so poorly mistreated by their captors and their liberators that, yeah, it's important to remember them as well, which is also why, you know, I chose this subject that then you chose for me to cover today.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, it was a complete war of annihilation, and you know, one of the things that, like, I hope that, like, these discussions help do is help break down misconceptions, and also some stereotypes and stigmas attached with, you know, talking about the Eastern Front. And yeah, like, some of our conversations may be viewed as controversial by some people, but I think that as long as we are talking about them, I think that's more of to open up that dialogue and conversation in a light and respectful way.
And I think that the last thing I want to say on the issue of the Soviet POW, and I might even future me and listener edit this at the very beginning, is Soviet POWs in general are quite a controversial topic because of the way that the Soviet government publicized the Holocaust. In the Soviet Union, the Holocaust was advertised as a anti-Soviet event where they were the main victims, when obviously they were the second highest victim and their suffering is unsurmountable. But the Soviet government didn't tell the entire truth, and 6 million Jews died in the Holocaust. And it's important to remember that there is no competition in suffering. A human suffering is a human suffering. And the Soviet government played up or made their suffering more important than the suffering of the Jews. And it's important to not do that in this context and be like equal in the understanding of the suffering of people.
Yeah. Totally agree. I totally agree with you.
Wonderful.
Yeah. So now I'm going to talk about my topic of discussion that Frank picked for me. And that's going to be the use of incendiary bottles in the Great Patriotic War by the Red Army and the Soviet forces. Because if you look at sort of today's culture, here Molotov cocktails getting used in riots, and if you know a little bit about history, you might know that they were used extensively in the Winter War from Finland against the USSR. But a lot of people don't actually realise the extent of these makeshift weapons becoming actually produced in factories and issued out to troops in the front line. People don't realise that, and I think that'd be quite an interesting subject to talk about, and their effectiveness, really. So yeah.
It's something that I'm personally not too familiar with, so I'm actually quite looking forward to hearing all about this. I mean, as you said, I sort of know the basics of, Molotov cocktails and a little bit of how they got their name, but when push comes to shove, that's about my extent of my knowledge. So yeah, really interested to hear what you've got to say.
Yeah, and like I said, I'm by no means an expert. I actually researched this over the past couple of weeks. So again, if I do get anything wrong, just let us know, and we'll, share the education, share the knowledge, really. So yeah.
So what is the history of incendiary bottles? I don't really know much about them.
Well, you can kind of find incendiary bottles or jars or ceramics getting used all the way in ancient times, with Greek fire and such, and burning tar. But in the 20th century, they kind of came to more of a prominence in the Spanish Civil War. There was limited uses of armoured forces during the Spanish Civil War. Again, I'm not a tremendous expert on it, but you would find T-26 tanks supplied by the Soviet Union, Panzer Is supplied by Germany, and in Spain at that time, anti-tank weapons weren't exactly prominent. If you had somehow a 37mm anti-tank gun, you're probably pretty bloody lucky. But at the same time, for Joe Bloggs, the average member, they would probably find incendiary bottles to be their main anti-tank weapon during that period, and they would see extensive first use by Franquist forces against Republican T-26 series tanks and BT series tanks. And you'd also find things like incendiary blankets, where they'd soak blankets in flammable mixtures and use them to try and jam into the tracks and running gear of tanks. Don't want to be that guy that's sitting there running around the battlefield with a petrol-soaked blanket. But yeah, supposedly that's where it's kind of started in the 20th century, at least. The main prominence would come later, though. Not too far later, but later, when the Finnish army would start coming across Soviet tanks during the Winter War, where you would tend to find things like T-26, T-28, BT series tanks. T-35s weren't used in the Winter War, if I'm right. That's an
Not used.
Yeah, KV-1s were, I believe, though. Prototypes.
Sorry, say that again?
Or KV-1s were?
The prototypes were trialled in Finland, but they didn't see massive use.
Yeah, I thought that. But yeah, so early Soviet light and medium tanks would get faced with these Molotov cocktails, as they've become to be known as. Interestingly enough, you would find that the name would actually come from the Soviet Minister of Foreign Affairs, which is quite ironic.
The Finns aren't renowned for their humour, but that is very humorous.
Yeah, so during the Winter War, the Soviet Air Force would bomb Finland quite extensively with SB fast bombers. And you would tend to find that quite a lot of the bombs they would drop were incendiary cluster munitions called Molotov breadbaskets, and that term itself would come from one of Vyacheslav's speeches where he turned around and said, "Oh, we're not bombing Finland. We're delivering, we're airdropping food to starving Finnish citizens." So yeah, that the term came from, okay, here's a drink to go with the food from the bread baskets that they were dropping.
Yeah.
So it was kind of a dry humour or a wet humour, I suppose. Yeah. Considering the petrol. So yeah, they would actually produce them quite extensively by the Alko company in Finland, which still exists today. And they would come up with more refined methods of use, which we'll talk about in the future. And you know, it's quite, they had quite a devastating impact. I mean, I'm pretty sure, as you know, Frank, you volunteer to be tank crew, and I'm sure you know that tanks aren't exactly the most sanitary things in the inside.
No, definitely not.
Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty sure you could tell us more about how they're covered in oil and just there's probably petrol, you know, smelling everywhere.
Yeah,
ammunition. So
it's quite interesting. I mean, for my second book, when I'm writing about the T-34, one of the design requirements is it has to be burning liquid proof. So the experience they've got from the Spanish crews and in Spain and in Finland, you know, these petrol weapons are, you know, incredibly effective against their tanks. And yeah, when they designed the T-34, it specifically states it has to be burning liquid proof. So yeah, it has a defining impact on the design of the T-34.
Yeah, I mean, especially if you look at sort of the rear part of a T-26 tank, you actually look at the exhaust, the engine vent cover, and it's literally, it's kind of like a big hole with sort of a grating over the front of it. And if you think about an actual engine bay on an early Soviet tank like a T-26, it's not going to be, again, a sterile working environment. You know, it's going to be, there's going to be oil, there's going to be petrol, there's going to be exhaust fumes there, all of which are very flammable. And as you know, like things like axle grease and, you know, all the flammable muck that's just built up in these sort of engine bays and in the areas of the tanks. They're extremely flammable, and especially if it gets into the fighting compartment where there's ammunition, you're going to have a bad day. So yeah, especially when you would find in ambushes that the Finns with partaking Soviet forces, you would find that a lot of the time the tanks would be unbuttoned. So the driver would have like his little slit open, and the tank commander would be looking out of his hatch. So the tanks would be open to attack, and if the flames got inside, well, you're kind of
That's it. Yeah, you're done. It's interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, from the tank history side of it, during the Winter War, T-26s had a cover placed over that air intake. They've got two. They've got one right above the engine and one at the very back. Both are highly susceptible. And they put something called, they just called it the ski slope, which was this metal wavy cover on top of it, specifically to stop burning liquids entering the vehicle. So yeah, you know, as early as the Winter War, the Soviets are looking at flame weapons for an infantryman and going, how do we make our tanks flameproof?
Yeah, I mean, another thing to like look at in particular examples of, especially in the Winter War, Finland wasn't exactly a tremendously industrious nation at this time. It's quite a fairly new nation, brought out from the end of the First World War and the Russian Civil War. So they have some anti-tank capabilities. They have some anti-tank guns bought from other countries. They have anti-tank grenades, but again, these are expensive weapon systems to produce. All are highly likely. You know, if you lose an anti-tank gun, it's going to be quite difficult to replace. anti-tank grenades, again, they can be quite expensive as well. Especially you're talking about what do we do to get that standard infantryman to be able to destroy a tank. We have to come across that balance and expense, and I think that's where you tend to find that the Molotov cocktail, as they would call it, came to prominence, because it was,
it's such a simple weapon as well. A bottle with a rag and some petrol, how much does that cost to produce compared to an anti-tank gun? And then you look at its effectiveness against the Soviets in the Winter War, and you're using something that probably costs less than $1 in modern money to take out something that costs $500,000 in modern money. It's a no-brainer.
I mean, even just as a psychological weapon as well, if you're a tanker and you're just sat there and you're T-28, you're in one of the tiny little turrets at the front for the machine gun, and next thing you know, the tank's on fire. So on the outside, it hasn't managed to get inside the tank, but you're still going to be...
It's getting hot very quick.
Yeah, you're going to be, pardon my language, but filling your pants quite quick.
Oh, yes.
So one of the things that you're going to want to do is get out. And, if you're getting out of a tank, you're leaving its protection. And, it's not just one guy sat there with a single Molotov. These would be surrounded by regular infantrymen with rifles, machine guns.
Coordinated attacks, yes.
Which we would see these same tactics later on with the Soviet adoption of use. The Finns would become quite experts in using them.
So, what about Soviet adoption? What sort of things did the Soviets take away from their experience with these kind of weapons in Spain and Finland?
Yeah, well, as we discussed previously, and as you mentioned, Soviet tank design learned pretty quick to try and, like these angry Finns with vodka bottles filled with petrol and other instances are, they're quite a threat. Maybe we could use these, because again, you would have the sort of first anti-tank grenades would be the RPG-40, which again came in service in 1940. I believe, actually. I'll need to double check that. But again, these are quite expensive weapons in the grand scheme of things. The Soviet Union is looking at a way for them to have the ability to take out tanks on a cheap scale. And when they see the uses of the Finns and the experiences from fighting in the Civil War from Spain, they realise that this is something that they can use, and they see the refinements that the Finns have made to the design, and the Finns make it a lot safer to use of what in their designs. When you actually think about it, they do make quite a lot of sense, and I would rather throw one of the more refined ones compared to one of the early ones that, the most common depiction of with the burning rag hanging out and stuff like that. It's not something that I would want to be holding on to, a flaming bottle.
Yeah. I've seen too many videos of someone, chucking over their shoulder to throw it, and all the liquid comes and burns their back, and you're sort of thinking, that's not entirely safe, is it?
Yeah, it's not entirely safe. And if you think you're in a night ambush and you're sitting there, you're waiting on, the German tanks coming up, okay, pick up your bottle. Your assistant lights it. The assistant's lighted it, and now you're a walking torch, and the enemy can see you. Again, the Soviets will also come up with other ways to try and mitigate the risk of them. Again, they're still quite dangerous weapons, especially if you are running about in a battlefield with glass bottles filled with highly flammable liquids. They would tend to break, but again, we'll talk about that in a couple of minutes.
Yeah.
But yeah, you tend to find that the Soviet lessons from the Winter War would entail on them saying that and thinking to yourself, we can use that for our own troops. And in 1941, do start issuing and start playing about with the idea of what they can actually use. They would come out with particularly 3 different versions. So you did get a KS or KC, depending on the translation that you're going with, bottle. You get a number 3 type of bottle and a number 1 type of bottle. Don't ask me where number 2 went. I don't know.
Out the window.
Yeah. So different bottles would be used differently. The number 1 and number 3 were different versions and different makes and materials used, whereas the KS was something a bit more special. So the KS essentially, the meaning of it in the translation itself kind of relates to self-igniting.
Okay.
So once the combination of chemicals and the mixture of the bottle, once that would react with air, it would then catch fire, and it would become a self-igniting, and it would stick to a target. You tend to find it was quite sticky, almost like a napalm sort of substance.
It's an almost chemical weapony kind of sounding thing, if you get what I mean. You know, it's chemical warfare to to light your bottle. Yeah,
exactly, and that's where you'll see quite a lot of the chemical regiments within Soviet infantry divisions, and a lot of like their use, a lot of their time would sometimes be filled with handling some of these bottles, not them exclusively, but especially when we come on to later what we're talking about, they'd be filling some of these with special refueling carts for the KS mixture. And again, the KS bottles were far more dangerous to handle than the number 1 and number 3 type. Because if you broke the number 1 and number 3 type, they relied on a separate source of ignition. They wouldn't react with the air. However, the KS one, if for instance that broke in your special bag that you have for your incendiary bottles, then you're going to become a human torch effectively.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and they noted in the manual that I have here, they actually detail that quite extensively, and safety with these is quite a prominent concern. Especially, they would tell soldiers that if they ever found smoke coming out of one of the boxes containing the bottles, to not open the bottle but to bury the bottle in dirt, because if it goes off, it's going to go off and it's going to take the full amount of the incendiary bottles with them.
So I wouldn't want to do that under pressure, I tell you, you know.
Yeah, exactly. So it's one of those ones that you wouldn't really want to be the guy holding it.
I want to be as far away from that incendiary device as I can possibly be, thank you.
Yeah. So one of the more prominent examples of a KS bottle getting used and sort of not really working out for the person intending to be throwing it was by a Marine, a naval infantry of the Soviet Pacific Fleet that had volunteered to go and fight in Stalingrad. So on October 2nd, 1942, Soviet Marine Mikhail Arivainovich Panikika, probably butchered that, volunteered, was a volunteer to go and fight in Stalingrad from the Pacific Fleet. And he participated in the defence of the Red October factory. If you are kind of a historian and you look into Stalingrad, the Battle of Stalingrad, it's quite a famous engagement. So essentially tanks were attacking the Red October factory and they were breaking through the area of Mamiev Krogan, and the Marine in question, Mikhail, he was about to engage a German tank with a KS bottle. He had it primed and he was about to throw it. When he raised his hand to throw it, a bullet cut the bottle and that ignited. So the bottle ignited. Flaming sailor the flaming sailor then rushed head on to the German tank and hit a second hit it with a second bottle whilst on fire.
Wow.
Not yet burning on the bottle. Not yet burning bottle on the grill of the German engine on the grill of the engine hatch of the German tank, from which the tank immediately caught fire. German tankers decided that they were attacked by a detachment of special Russian kamikaze tank arsonists, which had a sort of prominent impact on them and resulted in the Germans keeping their tanks a little bit further back, taking them away from the sort of close confines. So they started bringing their tanks back away, which would result in infantry not having tank support. And then his colleagues also managed to set fire to two more tanks. An attack was repelled, and later on he would become a hero.
Did he survive, or?
Oh no, he didn't.
I was going to say. I mean,
yeah,
wow.
He was awarded it posthumously. So yeah, quite a grim story.
Absolutely,
but,
absolutely.
If you imagine being that German tanker and then seeing a flaming man running towards you and then blowing up your tank.
Yes, you would quite seriously question what kind of enemy you are fighting. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. No, it's very sad, but at the same time, he managed to, successfully do his duty, I suppose.
Yep. So that's from the KS mixture, the self-igniting bottles.
Yeah.
He also had a number 1 and a number 3 type of bottles, and for this part, I'm going to use the English translation of the instruction for incendiary bottles, which was an English translation of the manual used for the issue of tank destroyers using these bottles. So I'm just going to read out a small excerpt. So, mixture number 1 consists of a thick mixture which is yellowish in colour. It coats metallic surfaces very well and sticks to them. The mixture is ignited by special devices, igniters, which we'll talk about in a little second. The temperature of the burn is roughly about 700 to 800 degrees Celsius. During the ignition, black smoke is produced in relatively small amounts. Duration of the burn is about 40 to 50 seconds long. After the burn, the mixture leaves a hard, opaque film. Used to the number 1 in the end of vehicles is very, very similar to the self-igniting mixture, because like I said, it was quite a sticky, napalm-like substance. So once it was on a tank, it would kind of stay there. It is like almost gelatinous, almost. And then it talks about how you would actually extinguish a number 1 mixture, which you would essentially smell it with sand, water or something, smothering the flame with a Chanel get coat or a plash palaka, a rain poncho. After the flame is extinguished, it will not self-ignite. And then you've got the number 3 mixture, like I mentioned. That's kind of similar to number 1. And that is essentially it's a more viscous version of the number 1, and it's brownish in colour as opposed to the yellowish colour, and it burns for about a minute. Otherwise, it's exactly the same as the number 1 mixture.
Okay. Yeah. It's quite different to the perception, at least I have, of like these incendiary devices of just a bottle or a rag. I mean, these sound far more well thought out in strategy. I mean, I can already think how you would use a sticky substance compared to a runny substance. I'm sure we're going to cover that. Yeah.
I mean, we was talking about tactics in just a little second that you realise that, okay, that actually makes quite a lot of sense.
It's a very smart move.
Yeah. And like I mentioned previously, when the Finns sort of started refining the sort of way that they would deliver and ignite these methods, you'd actually have quite a few different methods. And a lot of them were a lot safer than the traditional, burning rag. But there's different types of ignitions that was refined down by the Finns and then copied later on by the Soviets. And one of the main ones that you'd find is storm matches. So you've probably been camping quite a lot of times, Frank.
Yeah, quite a few times.
Yeah, so for anyone that doesn't know what a storm match is, it's meant to be a weather-resistant match that you could light and it won't get put out by wind. So what the Soviets would essentially do is, I'll probably send Frank some pictures of some, and he'll probably hopefully put them up on the screen. And what would essentially happen is that the bottle, what you would have two separate matches, or one, with rubber bands holding them onto the side of the bottle. And you would then, when it came to throwing the bottle, all you do is light the match, or one of the matches, or two of them, and then you'd throw it. And yeah, the match is going to be on fire, but again, that's a lot safer compared to a big burning rag, and stopping that from dripping everywhere. So it's a lot safer method of delivery.
So is it essentially like a captive bottle, so with a cap on, and the idea is when it smashes is when it ignites? Yeah,
exactly. So once the bottle actually smashes open, the mixture will come out and come in contact with the storm match and then ignite.
Right, I see.
Yeah, but you'd also, like I mentioned, you'd also have different methods of this, so it wouldn't just be always storm matches. You would also find small vials of the KS mixture would sometimes get issued out as well, and they would either be placed inside the bottle, or they would on occasion be on the outside, again thingied on, rubber banded on. And again, it's the same principle. Once you would throw it, the bottle would smash, and the glass vial containing the self-igniting mixture would then smash as well, and that would cause a chain reaction. And then later on, you would also find mechanical kinds of like grenade fuses that would get used, where you'd pull the pin and it would set off a mechanical chain reaction to help ignite the mixture. Again, I've got, if you ever do manage to pick up a copy of this, again, I didn't write this, however, it is an excellent guide if you are inclined to learn about the use of Soviet incendiary bottles.
Sorry, I think I'll definitely miss them.
Yeah, it's got quite good diagrams and showing you the actual mechanical igniters. Like I said, they kind of look like grenade fuses that you'd find on RG-42 grenades and F-1 grenades later on in the war, but instead they are for the incendiary bottles. So one of the things that you tend to find is, now that I've mentioned the different types of bottles, so you'd have your self-igniting, and then you'd have the ones that have a separate ignition. What you tend to find is the Soviet tank destroyers, as they were called, the people who were assigned to take out these tanks, whether they be hardened guardsmen, veterans of countless battles on the Eastern Front, or whether they are student in a constable militia regiment outside of Minsk. They are essentially got the same tactic to use. So they would get a small bag. Again, I'll try and find a picture to send on to you, Frank, and you can show the lovely viewers.
Yep.
And these bags would essentially have 3 sections, and we carry 3 bottles. Pardon me. You would find these 3 bottles. One of them would be the self-igniting mixture, and the other 2 would be the ones that require a separate ignition source. So when these tank destroyers would come up across a German tank, or Romanian tank, or Hungarian tank, or whatever other type of tank you're going to find in the Eastern Front,
a fish tank,
the first bottle they would throw would actually be the self-igniting one. And the reason for this is you would throw that first, and you would hit the tank, hopefully, if you're a good thrower. You'd hit the tank, it would self-ignite, and then you'd either throw another bottle onto it, or you'd throw both the bottles onto the tank. And that, if you imagine it, you're kind of, the whole point of it is this self-igniting bottle is the one that's doing the work.
Yeah.
That's the one that's sticking to the tank. It's the one that's pouring into the vision ports and, you know, it's the one that's proper doing the most of the damage. The other two bottles are essentially there to quite literally add fuel to the fire. So you're spreading, you're getting splashes everywhere across the tank. If there's any tank riders like riding on the back of this Panzer III, they're getting some as well. So yeah, they would tend to be used in that sort of instance. You wouldn't really be throwing just a number one type, or probably did happen with Soviet logistics, or just a KS, but the doctrine for it would be to throw one self-igniting and then two ones that require a separate ignition source. So yeah.
No, I mean, from the tactical perspective, I can absolutely see why they'd do that. Obviously, you got the one doing all the work, but there's the initial burning damage. You got especially I can imagine the liquid one being quite troublesome with burning liquids entering the tank, and in many respects that's the one which is almost drawing the crew out, if you get what I mean. The other two are for physical damage to parts of the vehicle, whereas that one is it draws people out, and a runny burning liquid is very dangerous.
Yeah, and then that also plays into the tactics that they would use them. And so ideally these tank destroyers would be using the incendiary bottles in ambushes. That was the ideal situation. You're part of the militia regiment, and you're in Kiev. You're waiting on the German vehicle coming along, and you've got your Molotovs ready, and your cohorts have somehow acquired their Maxim machine gun and a couple of rifles for your militia unit. So what's happened is, if you'd imagine being that German tanker, as mentioned previously when it came to like the Finns destroying Soviet tanks, once that tank's on fire, don't want to burn alive. No one wants to burn alive. That's a horrible way to die. You're going to want to get out of that tank. And that actually played into a lot of the facts of the Soviet tactics coming to it. So these ambush parties of Molotov cocktails would be supported quite heavily with troops with rifles, submachine guns, machine guns, anti-tank grenades that would get used in conjunction with these. And just as part of a regular infantry platoon, they'll be used to support. So the incendiary bottles are kind of designed either destroy or incapacitate the tank, or to draw the crew out of the tank. So, well, you can either capture or destroy the crew, depending on what the situation would permit. So that was the main tactic of them. But as I mentioned previously, especially for an example in Stalingrad, they tended to be quite effective in defensive situations in urban areas, especially in the offense as well. And you'd find,
I was going to say, I mean, they're so short-ranged that it kind of is perfect for urban warfare. If you're on a top floor of a building, I suppose as well, that makes your target of the tank far easier. And yeah, I suppose if it was an open field, say like it was a Kursk, you'd have to wait till the tank was right on top of you before you can do anything about it, because you'd then expose yourself to the enemy. Yeah, in urban fighting, I can see them being very effective in that role.
Yeah, so they're designed, and they only have that ability to destroy tanks when they're actually close in, quite like anti-tank grenades. Except when you're in urban warfare tends to be quite nitty and gritty. You're fighting from house to house, room to room. So what the opportunities to use these incendiary bottles are, the odds are multiplied with its uses. You can then use them in the offensive. You can chuck them into the house that you're assaulting through windows, doors, collapse walls. You can do that. You can use them to set the roof on fire of the building that you're assaulting to help draw out the enemy from their cover into your point of fire. So they were extremely brutal weapons, but they're also extremely useful in urban warfare.
I can imagine them being a massive deterrent. I mean, human nature is to move away from fire. So if you want to funnel the enemy into a particular killing ground, you could probably use incendiary devices to, block off a path for them. No one's going to want to go through that. And I can just see them on a tactical level being so effective at both. I mean, we've covered anti-tank use quite heavily, but even in, as you said, the urban warfare infantry role, being incredibly effective pieces of equipment for the soldier. Yeah,
I mean, even if you look at, like I mentioned before, no one would want to ever die whilst burning alive. And you'd also see that prime example with the Churchill crocodiles on the Western Front after D-Day, when most of the German bunkers would actually surrender once they actually saw the first couple of testing ranging shots from the crocodile flamethrower. So you tend to find that. So it was a devastating morale weapon that was used, and also you would be able to be using it anywhere. Nearly anyone could make it. If you imagine a partisan detachment in Smolensk, is probably the cheapest, most effective weapon that they can get their hands on. For example, imagine if you just took out that the German dispatch rider that's on his motorbike, siphon the petrol out of the tank and use your vodka bottles that you've got lying around or whatever, and there you go. You can still use. You now have the ability to potentially take out a German tank.
I mean, I think the perception from the layman, at least from myself, is this more like a partisan-y weapon? It's something that any old person with a bottle and some flammable liquid can use in a situation like that. So for me, it was very interesting hearing that like the regular Red Army was issuing these as weapons. I mean, it's only on the Eastern Front that we really see these sort of petrol devices being issued to regular army units. You look at the Western Front, and it tends to be more like flamethrowers, and even then, at least in the Western theatre, they're not as common as, say, the Pacific theatre. So it's quite interesting that they are a very Eastern European kind of weapon, in the sense. I mean, obviously, they've got their grassroots earlier in, say, Spain, but it's really in that sort of Eastern Front where they grow their legs and become a very devastating item of warfare.
Yeah, and it doesn't matter the amount of armour the tank you maybe sat in or the tank that you're coming across is facing. I mean, you could be coming across a Panzer II or a King Tiger tank. It's because you're not requiring to actually penetrate the armour of that vehicle. You still have the ability to still incapacitate it and knock it out.
Yeah.
And even take the crew from outside of it just with the pure morale devastating impact of it. So yeah, it's completely it is a complete effective weapon for the Red Army at the time. It's cheap. Anyone can use it, even if you were some farmer from the middle of Siberia that have never, like, the most technical thing you've ever seen before is a shovel. You'd still know, like, okay, you want me to throw this? Like, yeah, I'll throw this. Like, you don't really need to give that a large amount of training. Like, yes, they do have manuals for them, but don't actually need that gigantic amount of training in order to actually be effective with using them. You just need to not have noodle arms like me.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting as well that, like, the Soviets spent a lot of time developing this sort of weapon, but as far as I'm aware, the Germans really didn't. I mean, I have seen in popular culture, in movies, petrol bombs being used by the Germans, but they're not as sort of doctrinally ingrained into the German soldier. If you look at like how both sides approach the same question of how does an infantryman take out a tank as quickly and as effectively as possible, the Germans, being the Germans and over-engineering things, went down the road of magnetic mines and Panzerfausts and Panzerschrecks, and the Soviets have got this. I mean, it's not their idea, but they're using such a simple and effective way to take out their tanks. Yeah. It's genius in many respects when you think about it.
Yeah, exactly. And if you imagine if you're in a defensive line and you've only got Molotov cocktails, you've got RPG 43 anti-tank grenades. The largest gun that you've got is the platoon, AT platoon's PTRD or PTRS anti-tank rifle, which is, it's a large caliber rifle, and it can punch through the sides of a Panther tank without its side armor on. But again, it's still an anti-tank rifle. They are still going to suffer.
I mean,
so that's when you see that.
Anti-tank rifles really drop off after 41 in their effectiveness, and I think what we see is these rifles being used to immobilize a tank, and then the infantry use their flame weapons on the vehicle to then completely stop it from moving and from fighting. Anti-tank riflemen were trained to aim for like the tracks and running gear, because if you break a tank track, which is probably the easiest thing to break, that tank's now not going anywhere. It's a sitting duck for infantrymen with incendiary devices.
You'd find that like you mentioned, the anti-tank rifle crews and the light anti-tank gun crews, they would be looking for that mobility kill, where they can take out the tracks, road wheels, anything to stop that tank from actually moving. And then you'd probably have, the DP machine gunners or PPSH gunners trying to fire at vision slits to make sure that, they're not
going anywhere.
To keep them buttoned up and to stop them from looking at their optics, so they can't actually see these tank destroyers with the Molotovs and RPG 43 anti-tank grenades getting close enough to actually have a serious impact and get those munitions away onto their tanks. So in the defensive aspect, when they're combined into that section of different weapons, they are extremely effective.
Absolutely. So we're talking about like these weapons are very close range, and we're talking about in the street fighting how, because they're such a close range weapon, they're so effective. Was there any way that they could have used these weapons more effectively at long range, or something, a similar kind of device that was more long range? Is there anything like that?
Yeah, well, there was quite a lot of experiments and quite a lot of, there were issues, but albeit on a small scale. So the first methods actually comes from a 125mm implements thrower, and they would essentially fire a glass ball filled with the self-igniting mixture that you find in the gas bottles. So they would fire these balls that were originally intended for the Air Force use, for when they would be using fire bombers from like the POWs and SB bombers. So they had the munition already in service, albeit the glass munitions that they would use tended to be not as popular for obvious reasons, because it's made out of glass and you're firing it out of a weapon system. So they did tend to break quite easily. However, they were used in metal detectors, and well, not metal detectors, but scavengers that are going out metal detecting will occasionally find these glass balls scattered around Eastern Front battlefields. I mean, I actually saw an empty one on eBay. I think it was last year.
Yeah, I remember seeing that one as well. Funny enough, because I was going to bring that up. I saw one for sale recently.
Yeah, so they were a lot more prominent than what people would believe, and they're kind of quite a weird weapon system when you think of, okay, like how can we actually come up with a heavier way to take out these tanks? You've got most countries going down the lines of anti-tank rifles, which the USSR is doing with its PTR rifles that are coming up with, and then eventually into the D and the S models. And this thing is essentially a tube that is kind of like a mortar that fires glass bombs that catch fire, and you think to yourself, like, who comes up with that?
It does seem insanely dangerous, I must admit. The idea of just having a weapon which punts a glass ball, I mean, that in itself is just terrifying.
It would be. So what they tend to go on with this 125mm launcher is that they do get into production, and during the trials, General Zhukov was actually present, and he quite liked the idea. But then, they had to come up with refinements. So what they would do is they would actually come up with the same sort of like munition, but this time in a metal case that would still rupture once they actually hit the target.
Yeah.
So it would still have the same effects, but it'd be hopefully a lot safer. And then later on, you would tend to find things such as smoke bombs. So they would get used as smoke launchers for firing smoke grenades. And quite interestingly enough, they would also have propaganda munitions that they could fire, which would actually fire bundles of propaganda leaflets. The range of them wasn't terrific, so if you're having to like throwing those propaganda leaflets, it's a bit like pissing in the wind a little bit.
There's a strong breeze, it all just comes straight back to you.
Yeah, exactly. And if the enemy's that close, I doubt they're going to be wanting to read propaganda leaflets. So yeah,
it's a very Soviet thing to do, I think, isn't it? Like,
yeah.
Oh well, we'll throw everything, including propaganda, at them, and we'll see what happens.
Yeah, just throw enough proverbial at the wall, and hopefully it'll stick. So these were actually made in Leningrad, and they'd actually see quite a lot of service in the Siege of Leningrad, and a lot of people think they were exclusively used in the Siege of Leningrad. However, that isn't the case, and there is evidence of them being used in places like Sevastopol, I think in Minsk as well.
I seem to remember there was also footage of one being used in Stalingrad. Very famously in the World at War documentary. There's footage of some guys firing one. I think it's Red October Factory as well. Funny coming back.
Yeah, possibly. So they were used quite extensively in the early stages of the war. However, they quickly became sort of unpopular. And they were taken out of service in 1942, even though the manual of arms for the Red Army still list them as part of the equipment of a Soviet unit.
I think there's a de jure and a de facto being taken out of service. So, on a slight tangent, like the BT-2, for example, tank was taken out of service in 1940, but there was still 900 of them knocking about when the Germans invaded a year later. So.
Yeah, exactly.
And let's be honest, a weapon's a weapon. Someone will use it if they can.
Yeah, it's the same. It's the same with most out of service weapons within the Red Army at that time. When you'd find things like PD-40s in like 1944, yes, they're not going to be at the front lines, but they're still going to be used. Things like T-28s, these tanks and equipment that is no longer regarded as useful and that warrants extensive production anymore, but they're still going to get used in limited quantities, and you would find that throughout the war.
And it's genuinely surprising as well what you can find out there. I recently found pictures of Red Army militia using Canadian Ross rifles from World War One, the old straight pull, because they were given to Latvia as aid during the Russian Revolution, and they got put into Red Army stocks when they invaded Latvia. And then, yeah, they ended up being used by the militia until like 1944. And it's just such a bizarre weapon to see still being used.
Yeah. So as I mentioned previously, these weapons were taken out of service in 1942. And they were already at this point looking at the same sort of method of having an incendiary device thrown mechanically a further distance than what a human could physically manage. I mean, in the manual, it details that a soldier should be able to throw an incendiary bottle about 15 metres, which is relatively close range. And if you are, that will only be effective in either, as I mentioned, an ambush, urban warfare, maybe a forest, sort of environments that you won't tend to really want to find tanks in the first place.
Yeah.
And then later on, they are thinking to themselves, okay, we've experimented with rifle grenades before. Why don't we try and come up with a auto grenade thrower? Okay, believe it or not, they actually do go along this line, and they do actually start commencing prototypes, and they do start issuing them out to people. And the name of it that I can find translated is the Zuckerman bottle thrower.
Okay.
And if you imagine taking a grenade launcher, which is essentially like a cup that fits on the end of a Mosin-Nagant rifle, and then put the grenade in and fire it. So you can't really have the gas directly imparting onto the bottle. So what they came up with was you'd find a plate at the bottom, and it'd have several holes cut round on the outside diameter of this plate that would sit at the bottom of the cup. And that's essentially just to still allow the gases to pass through, but to not directly impinge on the actual glass bottle itself and having a bad day. So these would then be designed to not be a specialised item, but to be able to be fitted onto any Mosin-Nagant rifle that they have in service. So it actually mount onto the bayonet lug of the rifle, so it could be given out to most troops fairly simply.
It's a bit like the Dukarov grenade launcher system, where you just twist it onto the like a normal bayonet, and off you go, basically.
Yeah, pretty much. Except they would also have the on occasion they would also issue the same kind of bipods that you'd have with that, with like the really strange three-pronged spades that they would have with them. And that was the sort of idea. That was what was meant to replace the implement launcher. However, at this sort of stage, the Red Army is actually going back on the offensive. They weren't really fighting that defensive war anymore. And they were tending to focus more on the actual use of PTRD and PTRS anti-tank rifles, 57mm anti-tank guns, 45mm anti-tank guns to a lesser extent, 76. You get where I'm going with this.
Yeah.
But they were issued and did see extensive action throughout the war, but the use was still quite limited and quite forgotten about as they kind of fell out of favour. Also, to be honest, I wouldn't want to ever fire firing a rifle grenade seems pretty painful with the recoil that you get from that, but firing a heavy glass bottle.
Yeah.
Quite painful in the old shoulder if you try and do it that way.
Imagine it more like a Japanese knee mortar, where you'd use the butt of the rifle on the ground and that sort of thing, but actually shoulder firing.
Or like a British 2-inch.
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So I believe that's the way that they would be getting used, and so that sort of covers the glass artillery that you would find within the Red Army. They were quite effective. There's actually quite a good picture that shows one of the 125mm glass bombs filled with the KS mixture. It actually ignites, and it's just a massive fireball that looks like phosphorus just spraying everywhere.
Wow.
So yeah, they were unpopular to use, but troops would rather use more conventional methods. But if you've got it, why not use it?
Absolutely. Absolutely. That was a really, really fascinating chat. I mean, I learned a lot. As I said, I'm not too familiar with glass incendiary devices, so I learned a lot. From a reenacting standpoint, I want to get my hands on one of these incendiary bottle bags. I'd be interested to have a look at how you'd make a reproduction bottle, because I'm sure it wouldn't be too difficult. But
Yeah, I think there's quite a lot of reenactors out there that kind of make up mock ones that
Yeah.
look good for displays.
I think we've discussed it as a group briefly,
Mhm.
but no, this chat sort of made me think, yeah, that's something I'd like to do.
Yeah. I have tried it
Could
before.
cut it.
Let's try to get the bottles to look the right way style. But
So I hope that you've all learned something new. I know that I've certainly learned something new. I'd like to thank Jordan greatly for his time. I think this format is we're going to experiment with formats and how we edit and how we record. But I think for a first episode, this was really successful.
yeah, I've enjoyed talking. I mean, as a hardware kind of like test run, I think we've got quite a lot of informative topics that we can discuss in the future. And if people like what they see here, then yeah, I think this could be quite.
Yeah. And if you have any topics you'd like us to maybe cover, maybe leave them down in the comments section below, and we can add it to our growing list of things we'd like to discuss. So yeah, once again, thank you ever so much for watching. I've been Francis Pullen.
I've been Jordan.
And until the next time, we'll see you then.